Firstly, thank you for joining me for this talk. As every good skeptic knows, this is all open to revision, discussion, development in the future, and so on. History, like science, continues to progress and develop at a rapid pace. For all we know, everything I'm talking about now will be most redundant in a year's time in the light of some new technology or finding. After all, nobody expected a global pandemic. But here's some things that I've learned since the late 2000s about science podcasting and about radio and about some of the research behind all of those things. I first started amateur podcasting after attending a 1-hour workshop on GarageBand in an Apple store, and that was back around 2006. At the time, I was a philosophy teacher who wanted to do a master's thesis in education. My eventual thesis was a statistical analysis of beliefs in paranormal, pseudoscientific and conspiracy theories in a population of just over 1,000 Australians in the northeast of Australia. I did about 300 podcast episodes on a show called The Token Skeptic. It featured interviews that related to my thesis writing, such as academics in the field of skepticism and the paranormal. I then went to technical college for about a year to study radio broadcasting back in 2015, and at the same time I did a podcast every day show, and that was called the 365 Days of Philosophy. That soon led to doing some local radio, which is known as community radio in both Australia and the UK, or public radio in the USA. And that was for about 5 years. And then I got a job lecturing in introduction to radio courses while doing further study in radio and education. I also worked as an emergency broadcaster for natural disasters for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. That involved late night news updates on things such as major storms and very dangerous fires across the country during the summer months. Right now I am finishing my PhD research, and I still work in teaching creative radio, such as documentaries and storytelling in podcasts, and in a field known as strategic communication, which also involves science communication and health communication. I'm planning on doing some more podcasts with the Australian National University later this month with a music show on the pop culture genre called Dark Academia. That's more than enough about me, however. This is what this talk is really about. What I'm going to be looking at today is what's involved with podcasting in general, trends and findings, what's involved with science podcasting in particular, and what does it mean for listeners to these podcasts, what goes on behind the scenes. And I have some tips on interview and interviewee skills, including some ideas on what goes on with podcasts, particularly the promotion of a podcast, if you're interested in trying. If there's one thing I could suggest to you, if you are interested in trying podcasting, you should do so. I know it's difficult getting into an already established field. There's a lot of podcasts out there, and it's discouraging to know that your early shows might not be what you want, and you might not have the best equipment money can buy, you're not Joe Rogan, and so on. But there's a few reasons why, if you are keen, you should try, and I'll go into more detail as we go along. Firstly, if you don't know where the name podcast comes from, you're going to have to go back to around about 2004, where James Quidlan from Pod News did an investigation. He is an amazing researcher and a presenter on podcasts and radio. I will refer to his podnews.net website later on during this talk. Do check it out and do subscribe to his newsletter. His investigation into podcasting in the UK points to the writing of Ben Hammersley as the source of the word podcast. A podcast is a user-friendly way to stream audio files, usually MP3s, via an aggregator or a site or an app, such as the one shown here. When there's a new file or episode, it's downloaded onto your listening device, such as a computer or a phone. The podcast allows you to listen to on-demand programs. Access to information becomes asynchronous, which means it's free from the scheduled time of broadcasting of audio shows, such as those on radio. Podcasts are portable. You can listen to them wherever you want, with whomever you want, and as fast or slow as you like it, for example on any MP3 playing device. There's Bluetooth smart devices like Siri or Echo. Those used in the home can play podcasts or podcast via digital devices in cars. They're open to anyone to produce audio content. It's fairly simple, pretty economical, and all you need to do is get good audio. I'll talk more about that later. You put it online, and for many, that's how you become a producer, an editor, and more often than not, a presenter in the process. As you can see, in 2021, podcasting started to go through quite a boom. Coronavirus actually had some sort of value in this regard. And this is a trend that we can see worldwide. If you want a good, straightforward guide, I would highly recommend the website of CJ Delling. She has a fantastic basic how-to series of instructions, how to do instructions on her website. Now, this diagram is a variation of something by her and has some of my own additions. In short, it's a straightforward sequence of planning, preparing your sound, recording it, boosting the sound or clarifying it, and getting it out there. So what's happened to the history of podcasting since the early 2000s to now? What we've seen is a movement from what could be called a wild west of podcasting access for amateurs, which is still true to some extent now. So from fairly open in terms of accessibility to creating content, there's become a move towards more professional and monetized world of podcasting. I think you'll find that this is happening even if the levels of polish to the final audio or creativity are different from show to show. I'd like to make it very clear that even though a show might be amateur or organised or classed as professional, these are my terms and they're not meant to be judgmental. You can have an amateur show that sounds just as professional as any out there and a professional show that seems to be done using a couple of tin cans. But this helps me, in my mind, to understand the growth of networks over time. And let's have a look at that. Now, for example, the amateur skeptical podcast Skepticality first started in 2005, and it was one of the first, and I think even the first podcast that was skeptical in nature. It featured on the keynote address by Steve Jobs that year of Apple, when he was talking about the top 9 podcasts on the iTunes Music Store. It was recorded in the home of the hosts of the show, and it's since gone into hiatus or possibly pod faded, which often means it's discontinued for podcasts. For a podcast success story, well, Science Versus started off as one of several efforts in 2015 in order to support new podcast talent in Australia, and that was via the National Government Broadcast Network in Australia, the ABC. After a few episodes, Science Versus was picked up by Gimlet Media in the USA, and they're doing so well commercially they now have a research team rather than just the host Wendy Zuckerman, which was the situation when she first started her show. The trend towards seeing podcasts as profitable entertainment is reflected in the numerous radio shows that have also become podcasts. And it seems like anyone who is, and if anyone at all, in the media world or politics, from Obama to the New York Times, they have a podcast. They even turn up on streaming TV like Netflix. Originally, podcasts like Dirty John and Homecoming and WTF with Mark Maron, used to just listen to them. And then they became a podcast show that turned into a TV show. In 2017, for example, the New York Times debuted the Daily News podcast, and it now has a bigger audience than their newspaper, and it leads people to the website with its content. And then podcasts enter popular discourse as plot devices in TV shows. Some of you this year might have enjoyed watching Only Murders in the Building, which features a famous skeptic, Steve Martin, the comedian. The show reflects what is known as the serial effect, which started after the production of the Serial podcast in late 2014, which is about a popular trend towards a listenership in true crime podcasts. In fact, the entire show of Only Murders in the Building is pretty much a parody of how people get so much into true crime podcasts that, well, They become investigators themselves, and it has several really obvious jokes about the serial podcast and ones like it all the way through its show. But back to science podcasting, what does this mean for them? Well, you get a mixture, just like, as I mentioned, of different kinds of podcasts. As a result, across thousands of amateur and organised and professional standards and support levels and production. There are those which are produced as chumcasts, as McHugh calls it. And they are friends around a microphone or done in home studios, maybe with a range of equipment from just a laptop, maybe access to a college studio or an actual sound studio if they're lucky, and they might have some funding through subscriptions like Patreon. Then there's formal networks of digital media companies, groups like Gimlet or Wondery or Radiotopia or Midroll Medium. They are creating or picking up existing podcasts and making them join their brand. Then you have the big stars, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the naked scientists, who more often than not are early adopters of the medium of podcast. Now, this is something Dr. Steve Novella of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe has openly admitted has a lot to do with their success in podcasting. They capitalized on the early days of podcasting back in the mid-2000s, and they used that reputation and built it up over time, and that's why they have podcasts as a big part of their identity. The mixture of various levels of expertise and production doesn't seem to have much of an influence on the uptake of podcasts. People get into podcasts for the content. People get into podcasts because they connect with the people who are making the content. They're into podcasts because they're useful or engaging, and the fact that you can have the ability to turn off a show and return to it, it doesn't seem to prevent people from wanting to have sustained listening. As demonstrated by Drew's research into educational podcasts in particular, the opportunities to learn and be engaged at the same time are part of podcasts' appeal. For example, let's take one of the newest genres of science podcasts, the coronavirus podcasts out there. What you can see into research into coronavirus podcasts is there's still a tendency to use the traditional RSS feed of Apple Podcasts, and yet Spotify is growing in strength because, as a platform, they've adapted to realizing how podcasts are a big value add to their listening content in general, such as with music streaming. News podcasts become very important to updates on health science in recent years, and they're reflecting more than just plain news reads like you get with top-of-the-hour news on the radio. In terms of science communication, they're doing what many hosts in the past have realized, being human. And being human works in terms of listening experience. If there's uncertainty and ambiguity, that's okay. There's room to be open to developments. It's what we as skeptics should be saying all the time. Here's something that I often talk to my students about. This is from chapter 2. In the book, The Science of Communicating Science, The Ultimate Guide by Dr. Craig Cormick. There are entire courses called Science Communication. There are journalism skills that people learn. These skills are allies to podcasts. They are experience, they are tips, and they're a value add to the efforts of science podcasters and skeptical podcasters. The act of podcasting in itself is an effort to put knowledge into practice, and that's why I encourage it. Another advantage of podcasting is that it is so very much tied into social media. I don't think there's a single podcast out there that doesn't have its own Facebook page or Twitter account or Instagram. It's a useful online news platform, the podcast, and it ties beautifully in with all of those too. And as you no doubt know, there's so many things about science, various misconceptions, misunderstandings that are researched and revisited. This is where we find useful material to podcast about. And again, if you are worried about developing a voice, if you have concerns about your efforts in podcasting, make sure you think about the need for empathy. We all make mistakes. We can all be misled. We can all have ideas and notions that are open to revision. Put yourself in the position of when you were wavering on the border of something and what side of that border you eventually chose and why you made that decision. Now, this is one of the useful parts about podcasting. You can use a variety of methods of storytelling, not just dictating a message. So do listen to as many podcasts as you can, not just your favorite ones, because just like reading, you only improve when you have a wide experience of models and examples to think about. And speaking of which, be aware that your audience might also include those who cannot hear. I provide transcripts with my podcasts and I write articles. It's one of the inclusive things that Coronacast also does. They even have a sign language version of their show. These are things to keep in mind. If you want to reach an audience, what else can you do? So to sum up, what kinds of elements make podcasting science a useful strategy for skepticism? It's a mixture of the known and the comfortable and the creative and the different, in my opinion. And this is where you can allow yourself to explore and make something that can be both familiar and also unique. And as I said, have a look at what else is being done out there. Maybe you can do something similar. Maybe you can do something different. One of the things I've enjoyed recently is using podcasts as an exercise app. Check out Zombies Run. Check out Tour Audio. Being able to use a soundscape for a regular background. Suddenly the podcast is used as the new kind of sounds to a regular scene. Recognize that there should be something for everyone, and that might not be a typical audience. And of course, with new technology, there's always new ideas. And of course, podcasting comes with ups and downs. If there's 4 things that come to mind, it's these. There's no pressure as a newcomer to continue if you don't want to. Make sure you're heard and make sure you're consistent if you're making a show. I recommend these particular programs and sites, Levelator, Auphonic.com and Audacity. These are freeware. Use headphones. I use headphones with every single piece of work that I have in terms of audio. Look up mic distance and basic techniques. Transom.org helps you out with that. Have a think about opportunities, diversity. What can you make that is different to the stereotypes? And finally, you don't even have to care what I think about your podcast. Ultimately, this is your work. And you can make it as widely seen as you want, or just keep it to yourself and have a practice, and then eventually get it out there. Or never do. It's your project. At this point, I'm going to quickly touch again on some things you have to keep in mind if you want to get your podcast known. These are all things that require work, and these are some things that you learn in digital media marketing. For example, awareness and acquisition needs a website, needs social posts. Encourage word of mouth about your podcast. Get people to talk about it. Network on it. Create regular content. Make sure that you have a contacts website. Have goals in terms of how you want your audience to grow. And you can check how your audience is growing. You can check out the downloads. You can see how many people comment on your website. All of these are measurable things that you can see about your show. Encourage listener stories. Encourage them to be advocates for your show. Discuss with them. Do follows up. Sometimes people are passionately for or passionately against. Find out why. And encourage them to give that opinion to other people so they can listen in too. This is all part of media marketing known as loyalty loops. It isn't just a straightforward path that you get someone to listen to your show and then become a supporter of your show. It loops around and feeds back. Someone can be just as passionate one day and then not want to listen to you ever again. Find out why. All of these things are value adds to your show, and they should be taken seriously. And always keep in mind, the lightning in a bottle of science verses might not happen to you. But there are things that you can do to encourage and build that awareness and acquisition. Network. Have a priority social media. It could be Facebook. Maybe it's LinkedIn. Use Instagram. Use Hootsuite. Automate yourself across the different kinds of platforms so it's easier on you. Generate online inquiries through websites and Facebook. Find those people you want to have on your show or have discussions about the content on your show. Try to see if you can get 2 to 3 new leads, 2 to 3 new groups of people, or even just individuals in 1 month. LinkedIn is very useful in these regards. After all, science is often a very professional enterprise, and you want to find out where those scientists are. Often it can be through sites like LinkedIn more than, say, Facebook. Consider creating an opt-in email. MailChimp makes it very easy and free. Have a monthly newsletter. Have regular networks using social media, hashtags. Tell people about your work in the real world as well as the online world. Use it to create your own portfolio. Use it as something that you would talk about with those people who are professionals in your field. Have them on as guests even, and then encourage them to go on and spread the word about it. It's all part of what journalists do in order to build their reputation. It's something you can do too. Now here's the final part of my talk, which are tips in preparation for being a content creator or content contributor. If there's one thing I always tell my students, it's be kind to your future self, and that means making a plan ahead of time. Think about how your show is going to listen and have that editing frame ready. It could be as simple as having the intro tune and the outro tune, and then the rest you just fill in. Make sure you have consistent volume through every single episode. Do you have your plans for social media, your website, your mail list? Are they ready? Pictures and images tell 1,000 words, so use them. Think about how your show is categorized and make sure when it is listed on iTunes or any kind of RSS platform to get the podcast out there, you know how your show is described. We often talk about something called the elevator pitch. Can you talk about what your subject is in a minute or 2 minutes? Can you sum up your podcast with a slogan? These are very useful things to have in mind. And there's always room to improve, opportunity to change. A guest host suddenly is no longer available on a regular basis, so your show has to change. A friend has to drop out. They can no longer be a part of your program. That's okay. Your podcast evolves and changes. Now, not everyone wants to do interviews. Not everyone wants to talk to someone who is unfamiliar to them. Not everyone wants to have the opportunity to make a mess of things. But there are things you can do if you are interested in doing interview-style podcasts that you can do to prepare. First of all, have that plan. Know why you're interviewing this person. There is no such thing as cheating by letting them know ahead of time what you want to discuss. And I've had fights with people over this. More often than not, I will provide draft questions to the person I'm going to be interviewing because I want them to sound comfortable on air. You're not going to get people feeling like they're going to be faced with a shock jock or feel threatened. You don't need to do gotcha style interviews. It's entirely possible someone could dismiss you or log off, and people do talk about those kinds of interviewers. Feel free to give your interviewee an idea of what you're doing and why, and that can be done well ahead of time with interview preparation. Be patient. Let your interviewee tell the story. Feel free to do a follow-up. You've got more freedom than the average deadline-facing journalist. Be aware you're going to be able to ask the questions your audience wants to know the answers to. It's not always necessary to fill in every single space and every single gap with voice. Allow time to breathe. More often than not, when I'm doing an interview, I might, at the end of the interview, say, can we have another try at the first question? And by that point, the interviewee might be comfortable enough to return with a new answer or a fresher sounding answer, and then I just edit it in. Keep your recording device on. When people relax, they are more likely to speak and talk more openly and freely about a topic. Do be ethical. Do make sure that you tell them you are continuing to record. Can I use this audio in my final mix? But it's very important to make sure that you are getting the best kind of interview you can. And often that means allowing them to be represented the way they should be. We have the basics of journalism: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Use these. And be aware, improvisational games, voice exercises, warming up, having a bottle of water nearby so your mouth doesn't get dry. Practice your listening, practice your encouraging face. Even though you might be doing a radio show or a podcast show, the gestures you make and the expressions on your face change the way your voice sounds. Have a strategy with your co-hosts to allow balance. Signal to each other so you can have that flow through if there's a group interview. Make sure everyone contributes to the show, and that includes you yourself. It takes work, it takes practice, all of these things do. But over time you can develop it, and it does involve trusting your co-hosts if you have them, and most importantly, trusting yourself. Now, as the veteran of a great many interviews, particularly on my area of expertise in paranormal, pseudoscientific, and conspiracy theory beliefs, journalists can be just as uncoordinated as a new podcaster. And I've faced some terrible interviews and I've faced some great interviewers, and it doesn't matter how many years they've had experience in the industry, it can go either way. If you are finding yourself on the other side of the microphone as a participant being interviewed, be aware that you have responsibilities to your message, and this can include helping the interview be the best it can be. These include being aware that journalists can make mistakes, journalists can do the wrong thing. Find out who's interviewing you and why they're doing it, and be aware that off the record, as I said, as an interviewer, you can have the microphone continuing to run. Be aware that this can happen back at you as well. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. Never say no comment. Always have a think. Always have something that you can say, even if the answer is, I don't know. Note the key words from the initial chat with the journalist or the podcaster who wants to talk to you. It helps you prepare and anticipate. I've had interviews I've happily turned down because they've said to me, I want you to get angry about this. And I think, well, that's not my genuine response. I don't feel angry about this, or I don't feel frustrated by this, or I don't feel challenged by this. I find it interesting, but not challenging. Don't let interviewers push you into ways of responding that you don't feel is a genuine response. And this is where planning ahead of time can help. You set the scene, you practice your key points, you know your references. You say, if I'm going to be representing these ideas, I want to do it in the most genuine way possible. And you can even send out to them a fact sheet or a media release ahead of the time of the interview. If there is one resource, and I wish I could play this for you, but it goes for about 45 minutes, and, well, let's face it, you can do this on your own. Check out this interview, David Kestenbaum. He covers science for NPR, and he has a fantastic lecture on explaining the world in 4 minutes, which is often how long you might have to get an idea across. I listen to this at least twice a year. I have it on my iPhone and I'll play it. And I've recommended this to hundreds of students. It's one of the best how-tos to doing science in radio and podcast science communication I've ever come across. The link is here. It's at thirdcoastfestival.org, and they have a variety of awesome resources that you should check out. Do take some time to listen to it and do check out what he's experienced. Finally, some quick links to finish us off. If you want to add your podcast and make sure it's heard, add it to every podcast directory. And as I mentioned, James Cridlin has an amazing site on Pod News. Just go to that site and look for how to add your podcast to every podcast directory, and you'll find a really useful site through everything that he's got there, but particularly that. If you don't know Canva, get to know Canva. If you don't have graphic design skills, Canva helps you out. Transom is for radio, but it is also extremely valuable for podcasters. Resources, tips, how-tos. If you're going into the field with your microphone, if you're going to be going out of the studio and doing vox pops, which is interviews with the person on the street, Transom helps you out. And once upon a time, I used to use Duke Deck, and Duke Deck was AI music that was available for free. All you had to do was credit Duke Deck in your show notes. It has been superseded. It is difficult to find AI created music for free, but Ava is very similar to Duke Deck. So if you're looking for music for your intro stings or transition songs, so the little music that you might have between segments on your show, check out Ava. All you have to do is credit them, and they allow you to use it for free. And once upon a time back when I was doing student journalism for the first time, the push to keep my journalism local was a strong message throughout. And this might be the thing that you find helps you out in terms of being unique. Allow yourself to know and respond to your audience. Think about the individual listener, not just the group of listeners out there. What might they want to know? And always remember, the podcast advocate is looking to improve, even if it means you take a break to become better in the future. I've got some further resources and references on the tokenskeptic.org website. It does need an upgrade, so I need to take my own advice in making sure that my socials are up to date. I've got some podcasting tips there and a variety of references and resources that if you wish to have a copy of this, I'm more than happy to send it out to you. Some of the authors I find very, very useful include McHugh and Lindgren. And I already mentioned the amazing Craig Cormick's book, so do check that out as well. Finally, if you have any questions, if you need more details on my references, want to look at my official site, which is slightly more updated, you can check it out at kyliesturgess.com or email me on tokenskeptic@gmail.com. Thanks very much for listening.